Thank you, Andrew, very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to CSIS for hosting this event. Thanks to Tom Ricks for offering to discuss this talk today. As was mentioned, this is really perfect timing for a book on this subject, and it's not just because the interest in balloon boys started to wane, but in fact we do stand at a crossroads in Afghanistan, and we face problems there which I think are at their core questions of leadership. And I think also the solutions to those problems will probably have a lot to do with leadership. And so I'm going to first talk a little bit about how I came about writing this book. Then I'm going to go into detail on some of the points in the book that I think are particularly relevant as we think about how we move forward in Afghanistan. I arrived at the U.S. Marine Corps University in the middle of 2004, and like most recent PhDs, my interests were somewhat narrow. I'd been working on Vietnam War for quite some time. But coming in there, we began an overhaul of the curriculum that involved putting much more emphasis onto counterinsurgency, because we had a lot of new Marines coming in from Iraq. The new director who came in had actually served in the first battle of Fallujah, the one where Marines went in and were stopped halfway. And I was put in charge of a course that focused on counterinsurgency and looked particularly at foreign cultures and at interagency operations. And in order to do that, I had to go sort of outside my comfort zone and look at a lot of other insurgencies that I wasn't all that familiar with, and ended up, for the course, picking a lot of the cases that actually appear in the book. So we tested some of them, found some were better than others, and I've included the ones that I think are most helpful. And in the course of teaching this, I got to talk to lots of Marines. We also have a lot of Army, Air Force, Navy, civilian, international students. And it was really an eye-opening experience. In the course of putting together this course and teaching it, I came to the conclusion that we were not teaching them, in many cases, everything that we ought to be doing. And I had reached a similar conclusion about Vietnam from working on that. But if you look at the literature on the Vietnam War and many of these other wars, a lot of it's more written for academics than for practitioners of counterinsurgency. There's, I think, inordinate emphasis on strategy and abstract theories, and I think a lot of times far too much effort is spent on doing things like defining terms. So I wanted to do something that was really of great use to the practitioner. And the thing that ultimately pushed me into stopping work on Vietnam to do this book was the outbreak in violence in Iraq after the Samara bombings in 2006. And you probably remember seeing the images of dead corpses in Baghdad streets, dozens of them every night, American casualties going way up. So that was what finally inspired me to get cracking on a question of command. The book is largely historical. As I mentioned, I'm a historian, and so there are 9 historical cases, the last 2 being Iraq and Afghanistan, up to 2008. And it does draw at the end some general lessons from those various cases, although I point out repeatedly that in counterinsurgency there are very few instruments that will work in all cases. So an important part of the leadership is being able to figure out when you can use those particular methods. The first case I'm going to talk about is the Malayan emergency of 1948 to 1960. And I'm going to start in the middle of that insurgency in October 6th of 1951. So on that date, the British High Commissioner, Sir Henry Gurney, decided to take a trip to Fraser's Hill, which is about 65 miles outside the capital city of Kuala Lumpur. He went in a 4-vehicle convoy, but on the way, 2 of the vehicles had to stop for technical reasons. But they pressed on, and when they came to a turn in the road where they had to almost come to a stop, their vehicles were ambushed by 38 guerrillas. And Gurney's wife stayed in the car, but he decided to try to make a run for it and was shot down, shot dead. And this was catastrophic loss for the counterinsurgents. At that time, Malaya was still a British colony, and so this was the supreme authority in the country being killed in an ambush by the enemy. The war was already going against them, so it seemed like things just really could not get any worse in Malaya. Something very important happened just a few weeks later, and that was that Winston Churchill returned to the position of Prime Minister after elections in Britain. And Churchill, being a man with a keen eye for talent, selected Sir Gerald Templer to go out and take command of the counterinsurgency. And everyone knows that Templer came in within a matter of months, had turned the counterinsurgency around, and by the time he left, 28 months later, the counterinsurgents were on the road to victory. Now, the question of how he did it is much less well understood, and there's a common argument that what he really did was that he codified some best practices, put them into a counterinsurgency manual, and the distribution of this manual helped them figure out how to defeat the enemy. And in fact, you'll see that interpretation in the Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Manual, FM 324, and part of the reason that manual was written because of this belief that Templer's manual had been the be-all, end-all in Malaya. But I did some digging into this in the process of working on the book, and I found that interpretation just was not quite correct, because if you look at their strategy, they used something called the Briggs Plan. The Briggs Plan had actually been in effect since 1950, and the tactics they used, in fact, were not any different. They had, in previous years, developed some tactics based heavily on what had been learned in Palestine and Burma and southern Africa. So how was it then that he was able to use the strategy and tactics that had failed in the past in order to achieve success in the future? Well, the answer is that he was able to make dramatic improvements in leadership quality down to the local level. And he did at first start at the top. He fired his top subordinate, Vincent Del Tufo, who was described as the Secretary of State for Colonies as a man who has no power of command and gives out no inspiration and is, of course, quite useless as Chief Secretary. But Templer toured the countryside. He spent a lot of his time in what we now call battlefield circulation. He went out and questioned officers to see who knew what was going on, and he was not hesitant to fire people on the spot. And there was quite a lot of room for opportunity here. Among the people he fired were an officer who he described as an awfully nice fellow but quite gaga, and another whom he called absolutely burnt out and useless, although a nice chap. Templer was a fairly ruthless individual, but I think that's what the situation demanded. He brought in a new team of upper management, and in this he was greatly assisted by Winston Churchill, who promised to let him have the best and the brightest from the British Empire. So he went and looked all across Britain's far-flung possessions for top leaders. And for example, they picked a new commissioner of police who happened to be the police chief in London, who was a fantastic individual. And at lower ranks, he imported British and Australian officers from various places to lead not only British troops but also indigenous forces. And this is, I think, a marked contrast to what we've seen lately in our own personnel systems. So we've heard General McChrystal talk about how he can't get anything out of the Pentagon, and to get people out of there, it takes months, and we're still, I think, operating on a peacetime personnel system to a large extent. Now, Templer also, by spending so much of his time out in the field, served as an inspirational force, and many of the officers who were there testified to just the electrifying effect that he had by going out and talking to people. And he also spoke a lot to the population, and then in most cases also had a positive effect on him, although there was the occasional slip-up. At one village where the guerrillas had ambushed government forces, Templer showed up and declared, "You're a bunch of bastards." And the interpreter translated this as, "His Excellency informs you that he knows that none of your mothers and fathers were married when you were born." And then Templer continued, "You may be bastards, but you'll find out that I can be a bigger one," which was translated as, "His Excellency does admit, however, that his father was also not married to his mother." This is a result of Templer's personnel changes and his contagious